Good morning. Welcome to our 21st annual Community Mental Health Conference. My name is Larry Cohen, and on behalf of myself and my wife, we want to welcome you. We hope you'll have an enjoyable, educational, rewarding day here and come away feeling satisfied with and pleased with what happens. This is our most ambitious conference yet. We are having 3 breakout sessions. We're doing it both virtually and, of course, in person. We are trying, it's longer than I think any of our previous conferences recently. And so I'm going to be very brief. I remember some savvy participant in one of the evaluations said, "We came here to hear the speakers, not Mr. Cohen." And I'm going to try to keep my remarks that way. I'd be remiss, however, if I didn't thank the people who have made this conference possible. They include of course, the speakers and the breakout session leaders who devoted their time to it. They include the people who've made financial contributions, our sponsors, and the individuals and the others who have donated, because that's what keeps us going and that's what makes it financially feasible. We appreciate the Evanston Township High School for giving us and their facilities, which are, of course, wonderful. I want to thank particularly, though, the Chicago School and those many people who are here today from the Chicago School and who worked through the years with the Chicago School, and especially our executive director, Tracy Levin, who's put the whole thing together. So we owe a debt of gratitude and appreciation to all those individuals. I would like to also try to say very quickly why I think we're here, what we hope to achieve today. Our institute, which started 20 or more years ago, it was formed for one purpose, and that was to try to remove the stigma that attaches to mental illness. That had been a horror and a real terror in Naomi's life. And what we hoped is to try to reduce it and improve and not defeat it, but at least minimize it where other people would not go through that problem. The stigma I'm talking about is both an internal stigma. You know, why is this happening to me? And why am I being singled out? And am I the only one who feels this way? And will I ever lead a normal life? And the external stigma of how do you tell your friends, your family, your employer, what are they going to feel how are they going to behave once you mention that you have a mental illness? Our weapon of doing that, of trying to make that attack, was through education. We thought that more people that knew about mental illness, the more individuals that recognized the situation, who understood that treatment was possible, who knew how to relate to people who had mental illness, then the stigma would be reduced. I think we've made when we started 20 years ago, I was told that mental health and understanding of the brain was at its infancy. Well, maybe now we're at adolescence, because I think we've made some significant progress. We know that celebrities talk about their mental illness, and it's in the paper all the time, and people are not afraid to mention the subject. And there's still an enormous way to go. And what we hope to achieve is through this conference, through our activities, and that Tracy will talk about the other activities of the Institute, that we're going to be able to continue to reduce the barrier. But we need, and thank you, and your participation here helps us to achieve that goal. So again, thank you for attending. I hope you have a great day, and I'll turn it over to Tracy.
So I just realized I left my glasses over there. Okay. I'd like to take a moment to open with a land acknowledgement. Before colonization and settlement by people of European descent, the place we know as Evanston was home to the Potawatomi, Ottawa, and Ojibwe tribes, also known as the Council of the Three Fires. Yes, I skipped that word. I couldn't find the pronunciation. It's an alliance of the Anishinaabe peoples. It also served as an important crossroads and meeting place for a number of other indigenous tribal nations, including the Ho-Chunk, Illinois, Inoka, Kickapoo, Miami, Menominee, Peoria, and Sac and Fox nations. We acknowledge and honor the original people of this land, as well as the indigenous people that still call this area home, and support their continued work for justice, self-determination, and sovereignty. We recognize that land acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense or historical context. It is a foundation upon which to build mindfulness, gratitude, and appreciation. So thank you all for taking the time to be here today, to come together to explore this timely topic, especially on a beautiful summer Saturday. Every year, we include a lived experience speaker as part of our expert panel. How many people in this room might have been able to fill that role? Right? As a colleague recently said to me, who does this not apply to? For those of you who were with us last year, you've likely noted that we've made a few changes, some of which Larry has referenced. We've shortened the panel and added a third round of breakout sessions. We've added a networking session at the end of the day to give everyone the opportunity to come back together. The lunches will have no pickles in them to make them soggy. That said, I ask that you please take the time to complete the evaluations this year. We definitely use them as reference for our future planning. You'll see an orange page in your participant folder that outlines that process. For those of you seeking CEUs, if you haven't already, please sign in now using the QR code. That QR code is on that orange paper. We also have volunteers in blue shirts that have that QR code and their own devices, so that if you are somebody who isn't comfortable using that technology to sign in and to do the evaluations at the end, you'll be able to have the opportunity to get some support and assistance with that. We will also have volunteers in every breakout session to assist with the sign in and sign out process there. Everyone is invited to complete the evaluations after the panel and after every session. There is only one evaluation, so even though some of the questions may not apply to you, if you're not a licensed mental health professional, the evaluation questions that follow absolutely will apply. There is also an overall conference evaluation that you'll complete at the end of your final session of the day. So if you're leaving us after the panel today, you'll complete that final evaluation. Same thing after the first breakout session, after second breakout session. If you're staying with us all the way through the networking session, you'll complete that final conference evaluation at that point in time. And we'll talk more about that during the day. We've got volunteers to help and support. Our Office of Continuing Education has gone to a fully electronic process. And so we have to do what we can to make that work. One thing we haven't changed is having a space for people to go if you need a break from the action, some quiet time, some support. That wellness room is in E108, and you can find the location of that on the map that's in your folder, or you can ask one of the volunteers for directions. Another thing that we've maintained, which was a big hit last year, is the use of Slido for your participation and interaction. We're going to go ahead and test that technology. Again, there's a QR code on the conference schedule in your folder, or you can go to slido.com and you'll be able to see here. You may be able to scan the QR code that's on the screen. It asks for your event code number, and that is that 5219751. Your passcode, which is capital letters NRCI. If you scan the QR code, it might take you right to the evaluation. So in one word, how are you feeling today? Ooh, I like that. Excited, content. Good, okay, happy, hopeful. I like that. Because you have moderator version. Seeing a lot of interested, curious. Okay, we'll give this another few seconds to see what else we have. And the people that are online are also able to contribute to our word clouds and polls today. I'm sorry? All capital letters, NRCI. And the main reason for this one is to test, because when Dr. Young presents, she's actually going to have a poll and a survey. So we wanted to make sure it all worked. Okay. And still see a couple coming in. Got a couple tired, sleepy. I did have somebody say to me early on a Saturday morning, not so good. You know who you are. Actually, that could apply to many of you, probably. All right, I'm going to go ahead and move on. We want to thank our sponsors, American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, Erie Family Health Centers, Thresholds, North Shore University Health System, Trilogy, Yellow Brick. They are our patron sponsors. Ascension St. Francis Hospital, Linden Oaks Behavioral Health, Impact Behavioral Health Partners, Peer Services, Plenum Mind Center, River Edge Hospital, Rebecca's Dream, and Montrose Behavioral Health Hospital for children and teens. And of course, the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, they provide our infrastructure and support. Our Chicago campus dean, Dr. Michael Crawford, is here, as well as other members of our faculty, staff, and students. If you haven't already, we hope you'll take the time during break and lunch to visit the exhibit hall. There are many great resources. Quick look at what has NRCI been doing. Since June 1st, 2021, we've had over 3,000 participants in our education sessions and trainings. There have been over 100 events. And I'll comment that those may not be unique participants. We do have people that have participated in suicide prevention and mental health first aid and potentially other programs. Those events may be hosted by NRCI or one that we are a partner with or that we are invited to present. We have presented on adult mental health first aid for adults 18 and older. We're certified to provide that for special groups, higher education, fire and EMS, military members, veterans and their families, and older adults. We also do youth mental health first aid for adults who work with youth 18 and older. When we've just become a part of the National Team Changing Minds network of mental health responders dedicated to helping young people and especially young men of color recognize early signs of mental health challenges. Here in Evanston, we've trained 103 teens age 15 to 18 and 363 mental health first aiders between adults and youth. Our training groups include community organizations, all campuses of the Chicago School across the country, the City of Evanston, the Evanston Public Library, Schaumburg Township Library, Cook County Department of Corrections, Rays of Hope in South Africa, Rosalind Franklin University, Lake Forest College, City Colleges of Chicago, I'll stop there, and conference presentations for the Illinois Association of School Social Workers and the Illinois School Psychologist Association. We look forward to maintaining these relationships while we continue to grow and expand our offerings. Our team of doctoral fellows and graduate assistants, all here today, are instrumental in providing support for these programs, and all 3 fellows are certified mental health first aid instructors. In the coming months, we will offer additional mental health first aid and suicide prevention trainings, as well as preventing sexual harassment and ethics. If you're a mental health professional who needs to get those CEUs in before November, we hope that you'll consider us to help meet that need. For everyone, we're happy to work with you to provide affordable, virtual, or in-person mental health education and programs that meet your needs. During registration, we asked some optional questions. These are the results from those who provided responses. Lived experience, 50-50. Half of the people responded yes, half the people responded no. And that's really important when we talk about stigma. We seek to reduce stigma by honoring lived experience, openly discussing mental health challenges and crises, treatment and resources. 52% of care for someone with lived experience, 94% identify as concerned community members. I'm going to think that the other 6% were confused by the question. 66% mental health professionals, 34% are not. So we've got about 2/3, 1/3, and we're really looking, and I know that's something that has always been very important to the Cohens since I started, is that we really bring together the community members and those who are serving those community members to have the same conversation. And that's why we're calling this a community mental health conference. You'll note we've placed a sheet of national, state, and local resources in your folders. They're also available on our website. And on our NRCI table, we put out a new flyer about the 988 emergency number. Bubbles. I love this slide. You have bubbles in your swag bag. What do bubbles have to do with stress and anxiety? What kind of a swag promo item is that? It's a tangible way to practice slow, centered, deep breathing. Blowing bubbles requires you to pause, focus, and think about your breathing. Too fast, bubble won't even form. You need to blow that bubble slow and steady. You have to try to control your breath to form the largest bubble possible. You'll hear more about breathing from our panelists. Blowing and the bubbles themselves can have a calming impact on the nervous system. There's symbolism and visual imagery as we watch our worries float away, or we pop those worries. You can also imagine happy times from childhood if blowing bubbles creates positive memories and feelings from a stress-free time. You also have a postcard with box breathing instructions. Just 2 minutes a day of deep centered breathing will bring your cortisol level back to baseline. So let's get to the panel. Unfortunately, our planned moderator, Dr. Michael Horowitz, is unable to be with us today. We've invited Dr. Mark Reinecke, a conference committee member, former panelist and presenter, and longtime friend of NRCI, to act in his place. I will note that Mark was instrumental in finalizing the theme this year. We appreciate your generosity in stepping in at the last minute, literally. Dr. Mark Reinecke is Professor Emeritus of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and past Chief of the Division of Psychology at Northwestern University's Feinberg School of Medicine. He served for 14 years as the Director of the Center for Cognitive Therapy in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neuroscience at the University of Chicago. He is a distinguished fellow and former president of the Academy of Cognitive Therapy and a diplomat of the American Board of Professional Psychology in clinical psychology and clinical child and adolescent psychology. Dr. Reinecke is a fellow of, well, that was fun. Dr. Reinecke is a fellow of the American Psychological Association, the Association for Psychological Science, and the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies. His research and clinical interests center on understanding and treating depression, suicide, and anxiety among children and adolescents. He has lectured internationally and has served as a visiting professor at institutions in Europe and Asia. Widely published, he has authored or edited 11 books, including Little Ways to Keep Calm and Carry On, 20 Lessons for Managing Worry, Anxiety, and Fear. Dr. Reinecke.
Well, thank you very much. And welcome, everyone. Good morning, and I'm very glad you could be here. I just would like to say a few comments, then we'll introduce our speakers for the morning. I'd like to begin by thanking Marilyn and Larry for their inspiration, their guidance for organizing this organization. To Tracy for thinking of me and inviting me back. It's nice to be here. And it's really is a privilege and an honor for me to be able to serve as your moderator today. And I'd like to thank all of you, our community. And I'd like to think for a moment about why Naomi Ruth Cohen Institute, the foundation, is so important. If you think about it, there's three groups that are represented here. There's academics, scholars, people who do research on human development and mental health and treatment and prevention, clinicians, the people who take these strategies and put them out. And then the community, you, and it could be you have something, we note everyone has anxiety and stress in their life. There's no one who gets away free, but also family members, children, our kids, grandkids, our parents, somebody down the block. Everyone knows someone. Now, the reason that I've been a part of the Cohen group and the foundation, the Naomi Ruth Cohen Foundation, for better than 20 years now, why would I hang around? Because what they do is right in terms of their heart and how they feel about these issues and in the way that they think about them. And if you think about the three different groups, scholars, clinicians, community, there are very few places. I mean, I won't say this is unique in the world. There's probably someone somewhere doing it, but unique in the United States. If you've been to a conference, it's rare for all three groups to come together. Each of them has their own contributions and ways of looking, and together it's synergistic and it amplifies the effect. That's why it's so wonderful to have this organization and why I've been coming back and trying to support it for 20 years. There's something embedded in this then, which is that you're in the audience, you're now part of this. And I would encourage you to keep this organization in your heart and in your mind as you're moving forward. Now, today we're going to be talking about anxiety and stress. And it's a problem. Base rates are going up. There's no one who isn't touched by anxiety or stress, worry, and it's kissing cousins, trauma, right? Panic, PTSD, it's everywhere. But the problems are multifaceted. Everything, and there's a whole range of variables that play a role, from the molecular and the genetic through metabolic, biological systems and neurological systems, through development, early experience, the environment, the community stresses. And all of these variables, all of them play a role, and all of them are worthy of consideration as we're developing both prevention programs and treatment programs. And you say, Mark, what are you getting at here? If you think about all these variables, from the genetic all the way through the social, that's a broad gamut, that's a broad spectrum, and integrating them really is the challenge. All of them have merit, and that you're going to hear this from our panel and from all of the different individuals who you meet today in your breakout rooms. There is two things I would like to say. One is, whenever I would go to a conference, and I've been to lots of them, is I try to come out, a lot of the talks not so hot. You know what I'm talking about if you've been to a conference, right? But I do try at every conference to come away with a pearl of wisdom, something I can bring home and share with my students and share with my patients that will be of some value to them. I hope today you're going to be hearing a remarkable set of speakers today and this afternoon. I hope you come away with a string of pearls. Be listening for them as you're as people are presenting their work and their ideas. There's lots to be found here. That's number one. The second is we'll call it a call to action, which is, a number of years ago, I gave a talk in Australia, of all places, and it was a room about this size and several hundred people there. And we were talking about adolescent depression and suicide. And I offered the call to action to them as well. And the comment I said is, if each of you take something that you've learned here today and save one teenager's life, that will be a remarkable thing that will resonate out through the generations. That would be 500 kids in Australia. The same challenges for us here today. We all know someone who suffers from anxiety, stress, who's got worries that just weigh heavily on their heart. Today, you're going to be hearing from some of the best specialists in this area. Listen for the pearls of wisdom, and then the call to action. See how you can take them home and use them with just one person. And if we all do that with just one person in our life, it's going to have that amplifying effect. All right. Now, one final thing I want to share with you. I brought something to share, and then I'll introduce our speakers for today. I brought a book. I like to sail. I like to sail. And one of my patients many years ago, 25 years ago, this is the Ashley Book of Knots. Who knew that there were so many knots? And for anybody who's a sailor, look at this. It's a fabulous book full of knots, thousands and thousands of knots that, keep wincing. Thousands and thousands of knots that you can sit around and practice and try. But there is, on page, where did it go? 29. I put a post-it on it. How to untie a snarl. How to untie any knot. We've all had knots that we can't, oh my God, look at that piece of string. Look at that piece of rope. I don't know what to do with this. Let me read this to you. To untangle a snarl or loosen any jam or knot, open a hole through the mass at the point where the longest end leaves the snarl. Then proceed to roll or wind the end back through the center, exactly as a stocking is rolled. Keep the snarl open and loose at all times, and do not pull on the end. Permit it to unfold itself. As the process is continued to the end will gradually emerge. No snarl or knot is too complicated to be solved by this method. Only patience is required. We're talking about knots, aren't we? Now, our speakers for the day. Our first is Paula Young, and I have to say, it's delightful having her here. And for those of you who don't know Paula, you should. We've been colleagues and friends for a long time. I hesitate to say how long. You can read about her at her bio in the handout. She's exceptionally well-trained, got a PhD here at Rosalind Franklin, trained then at Penn with the Beck Group, arguably the world's leading cognitive behavioral therapy group. And I bring that up because she really is the voice of experience in terms of evidence-based treatment of anxiety. She's in the top tier of American specialists, clinical specialists in the treatment of anxiety. She's currently at Rogers Behavioral Health, which is right up the road. And one couldn't have a more experienced or a better clinician or an expert on your side for an anxiety disorder than Robin. Now, I bring this up because she's not only an excellent clinician, but an excellent scholar. And her work, she publishes in some impressive places, JAMA, Archives of General Psychiatry. Her work, first tier. And she's going to be sharing with us her experience in management of anxiety today. Our second panelist is Orson Morrison, and he comes to us from DePaul, where he's a clinical director with their, the Counseling and Psychological Services Center. Now, what's interesting with him is, we were talking before about the broad gamut. His focus, he is really attuned to culture, community, which I think fits with the DePaul model. The roles of environmental stress, of racism, of all of the things that are outside of us and impinge on us as we are moving through life. So he has a somewhat different lens than, for example, Paula or I, but it's a useful lens. And we were talking about this. We're all creatures of our development. I grew up on a cattle ranch in Northern California, and it informs who I am and how I think about things. He grew up in South Africa and then Guyana, coming to the United States. And that gives him, how would you put it, a unique lens, a prism through which he understands human experience. It's a different sort of view, but an informative one. And then our final presenter is Gabby Diaz. She will talk from the perspective of lived experience, and is a wonderful woman, an actress, a writer. She's I would say an administrator. What your organization? Yeah, we'll give her that. And I would note, I learned, which I'm very pleased, she is a Texan. So like me, I hope you don't mind. Hope you don't mind my mentioning this. She not only wears cowboy boots like I do, but she has the honor of having worn out cowboy boots. You've got to wear them a lot to grind a hole in the bottom. So I've heard input serves as a balance to the clinical and research focus of our other speakers. It's a wonderful panel. I hope that you find your pearls in the sand as you listen and that you're able to find some use for them in your life. All right, shall we begin? Paula.
Thank you, Mark Reinecke. We should do this every day. Okay, I'm going to ask everybody to help me out with a little audience participation on the Slido again. We're going to have two of these. And the first one, is this it? Yep, here we go. So if you can go back to the same Slido where you entered how you were feeling today and answer the next question, which is on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 means you have little or no stress and 10 means you have a great deal of stress. How much stress have you experienced in the past month? Wait, this is exciting. This is fun. I'm getting a lot of answers that I can't exactly see. All right, looks like we got most of our answers, and are there more coming? So what's our biggest section? 5 or 8? 5 and 6. Okay, well, thank you for doing that. And it looks like our most popular number is a what? Is a 7. 23% of us have a 7. Well, the reason I asked you that is to compare you to the national sample that was given back late last year by the American Psychological Association for 3,000 Americans. They asked the same question. And the average score in that sample of adult Americans was a 5.0, which had been ticking up since the beginning of the pandemic. And it looks like, right, our group looks like a little bit more stress than that. So I'm glad you're here. The other thing that was interesting in this study, they administered the study in English and Spanish. They broke it down by age and gender, race, ethnicity, education. I'm just going to take the top line items for us today to talk about the impacts on health and mental well-being. So in this study, we found that 76% of the people who responded reported that their lives were negatively impacted by stress. And that breaks down into about a third saying that their mental health was impacted by stress, eating habits, physical health, their interest in hobbies and activities. Another 76% said that they had experienced some health impacts due to stress. And the most popular ones were headaches, fatigue, feeling nervous or anxious, feeling depressed or sad. 72% said that they've experienced additional health impacts due to stress, including feeling overwhelmed, experiencing changes in sleeping habits, worrying constantly, or using alcohol, cigarettes, or drugs to relax. The last number, 27%, well, it doesn't sound as big as 72, but look at what they said, right? Over a quarter of Americans reported that on most days they're so stressed that they can't function. So I'm glad we're having this. I'm glad we're having this conference today to talk about it because it's impacting a lot of people in a lot of important ways. And if you said that you were a 7 or you have any of these, you are not alone. I think that's going to be my message. It's going to be one of my pearls today. Okay, this is the second Slido poll that I have, and then you're done. You could take a break for the rest of the time that I'm talking about. In one word, so we're going to do a word cloud here. Ideally, it would be one word because that's going to help us make a word cloud. What is your current biggest source of stress? And we'll give people, I don't know, half a minute to fill this one out. All right, we'll give you guys maybe 10 more seconds to fill this out. You know how a word cloud works is that the more people who say the same word, the bigger the word gets on the cloud. So it's looking here like work, family are the big ones. But we also have relationships, balance, health, and a whole bunch of others. And the point here is that anything can cause you stress, anything at all. So what do I want to highlight? I want to talk about the types of stressors that are likely to cause you to have some sort of physical complication or maybe illness related to it. This is a questionnaire called the Holmes Reheat Life Stress Inventory. And what we have here is a list of, are they, yeah, you can kind of see them. This is also available on the internet if you want to go and take this inventory yourself. They have a list of major life events that are known to increase the likelihood that somebody's going to have an illness related to them, a physical illness related to them. And they're rank ordered by how stressful each one is. As you can see, the top one is death of a spouse. And the number there is 100. Does 100 mean anything? No, just for this scale. So what you do is you go through and you circle all the events that have happened to you in the past year, and then you add up the point values on the right side to get your score. Now, what we see is for people who have a score of over 300 points, they have an 80% chance of having a major health breakdown in the next 2 years. If you're in that midsection, 150 to 300 points, you have a 50% chance of having a major health episode or breakdown in the next 2 years. And if you're one of the lucky people, who are under 150, congratulations, you're going to be okay. So is stress always bad? Is stress always related to negative health outcomes? No, not exactly, because our bodies are made to cope with intense stress. We have stress as part of our lives, and our bodies are designed with stressful situations in mind so that we can cope with them. So in an emergency, our bodies have a built-in system, survival mechanism, and it's called fight or flight. You might have heard of this before. It's part of the autonomic nervous system. Autonomic sounds like automatic, kind of is. It means you don't have to turn it on. You don't have to think, oh, I better activate my fight or flight now. It comes on by itself. You'll see in a moment that that's not always a good thing. What does it do? Well, it's set up to help you and your body either, they call it fight or flight, but my first choice would be to run. To help you either run or to fight for your life, right? So what do you need to do for that? You need to get energy to your big muscles, your running muscles and your fighting muscles. So we often have an increase in your heart rate. Your heart goes faster to get blood and energy to your muscles, to your big muscles, so you can run. It kind of diverts them away from your digestive system. It's like, it's not time to eat lunch. We got to run. It increases your respiration. You can breathe more to get more oxygen into your circulatory system to get them to your muscles so they can do what they need to do. There may be increased sweating to cool the body off while it's doing that. Some evolutionary psychologists say, oh, the sweating is helpful because it makes you more slippery if somebody's trying to grab you. I don't know about that. Glucose is also released into your bloodstream to supply energy. So all of this, your whole body is made to be able to survive an attacker or a saber-toothed tiger. But what happens if you're in a Zoom meeting and somebody asks you a question in front of your boss and you perceive it as a threat and your fight or flight kicks on? It's not going to be really adaptive. That heart rate that you would normally use in order to be able to run or fight is going to feel really out of place and probably kind of uncomfortable. That increased breathing that you're going to need to get oxygen to your muscles to fight or flight, that's going to feel uncomfortable too. And it might even feel like you can't catch your breath. You might feel dizzy. You might feel like things around you aren't real. The sweating that's going to happen in that situation might feel uncomfortable or even just be a source of more embarrassment if you think people are looking at you and judging you for it. So the false alarm, right? It's an alarm, but it wasn't meant to be. That false alarm of fight or flight is often what kicks off panic attacks in people. Okay, so when we're talking about stress, there's some of it is okay and our body's meant to handle it. But the chronic stress, the short-term stresses, we're made to handle that. Chronic ones, not so much. So I'm going old school on us. I'm going Hans Selye's research from the 1930s and the 40s. And it's called the general adaptation syndrome. And it's going to be a lot of the foundation stuff of what I'm going to be talking about today. But this is a 3-step process, and it starts with the alarm reaction phase. That's that fight or flight thing I just told you about. And then as the stress continues, you move into the resistance phase. So in this phase, the body tries to adapt to the stressor. It releases other hormones like cortisol. You've heard of that as the stress hormone. And it's trying to help the body cope with longer term stress. Often this works out okay, but if that stress continues, we can reach the exhaustion phase. So if the stressor persists for a long period of time, the body can become exhausted, right? Resources are depleted. The body is less able to cope with stress and can lead to physical or emotional problems. Often when people feel stressed, here's another problem. Now I'm going to talk about the downward spiral. Often when people feel stressed, they turn to some behaviors that might seem helpful in the moment, and see if you recognize any, but can actually contribute to more stress. So some popular ones, including overeating. That's my go-to. And it's not like I'm overeating broccoli. I'm overeating highly processed foods, right? Which can contribute to the right weight and be an additional health risk factor. Substance use or abuse. You saw from that early slide that 15% of Americans reported that that's what they're doing to cope with stress. Increased social media use or doom scrolling. So we know that if people are on the internet or on their phone just looking at negative news story after negative news story, that that affects people's mood and contributes to the stress. Also, self-comparisons. If you're looking at somebody's beautiful, fantastic life on social media, a lot of times people feel more hopeless about their own lives. I've binge watching on here. I put Candy Crush, but any kind of gaming would do. Usually people say, oh, you know, you got some stress. I'm going to watch some TV or I'm going to play a game. Sounds great. But if you're watching Netflix and that little screen comes up that says, are you still watching? Probably means that you watch too much. It probably means that instead of a pleasant activity, you're probably avoiding some other problem that you should be dealing with. Also, if you're up at 1 a.m. on a work night or a school night, getting ready to watch one more episode, you just bought yourself some more stress tomorrow because you're going to start that day already sleep deprived. Bedtime procrastination, or sometimes it's called revenge bedtime procrastination. Also, when people are trading their sleep time for some leisure time because they're feeling so stressed during the day that they just want some leisure time and they're willing to sacrifice sleep for it. Well, again, the problem is that you start the next day with a sleep deficit and likely to invite more stress in. Being irritable with others. I don't know if it happens to anybody else in here, but sometimes when I'm stressed, I might be a little short or snipey or snarky. I might be kind of critical, and I might say some things to some people that feel like, oh, I'm just kind of letting off some steam. But every one of those negative interactions invites another negative interaction in return, which can contribute to my stress. So again, we're starting to talk about the spiral. I've got stress, but I do things to try to feel better that make me have more stress. And I invite you to think about what other unhelpful ways you may be coping with stress. Okay, so chronic stressors may not be as intense as acute stressors, like a natural disaster, a major accident, or a bear walking out in the woods, or saber-toothed tigers don't usually come after us anymore. But they tend to have a more negative effect because they last longer and it requires the body to try to cope on it on a daily basis. So there are many physical or medical states that are affected by stress. These are the big ones that I found. As you can see that at least half of them have to do with the cardiovascular system, right? Hypertension, high cholesterol, coronary heart disease, stroke. But there's others, obesity, above and beyond the overeating part. Autoimmune diseases, migraines, muscle tension, and backaches, just to name the big ones. Okay, well, in addition to the physical effects of stress, it often is studied in psychology, it's often studied as negative life events, can also affect our mental health. It doesn't mean that they're causing the mental health problems, but there's a strong correlation between stress and the onset of some of these disorders. So for example, depression, stressful life events, it's pretty common to find stressful life events before somebody has an episode of major depression. And I will say in my own practice, I have seen a bunch of people who come in and say, oh, right, Paula, can you help me because I'm stressed out? But when I do a full assessment, these folks are meeting the diagnostic criteria for a clinical depression. And what are those? See if they sound familiar from that first slide. A depressed mood, loss of interest in things that they usually enjoyed, not being able to sleep, not being able to concentrate, change in eating patterns, or feeling really fatigued. A lot of that lines up with slide one. So that might be another little take-home message, which is if you know somebody who's super stressed out, they may also have depression. In panic disorder, most individuals report an identifiable stressor in the months that come before the first panic. And it can often be interpersonal stress, physical health stress, or the death of a family member. In post-traumatic stress disorder, the diagnosis requires that there's a traumatic stressor that kicks off the disorder. But in addition to that, it looks like having life stresses in childhood puts you at risk for developing PTSD after a stress or a traumatic incident in adulthood. Insomnia is also commonly happens after a period of stress. And I'll just say some of our research at Rogers showed for eating disorders and substance use disorders, these were the programs in our hospital that had the biggest increase in admissions during the pandemic shutdown. So they may also be influenced by stress. Okay, well, now what do we do? I love the slide, right? Sometimes I have to remind family members of this, right? Never in the history of calming down has anyone calmed down by being told to calm down. So you know what I'm not going to do. But what kind of cognitive behavior therapist, like Dr. Reineke says I am, would I be if I didn't start by addressing that how we think influences how stressful we feel? So I've got a couple, some old ideas and a couple new ones. The original would be to, as far as cognitive behavior therapy goes, would be to talk about how you think about things influences your feelings, and your emotional response is based on how you interpret a situation. So there are many ways to interpret a situation that might be more accurate and less stressful than the way that you originally did. And we're going to invite people to explore those. So one thing that happened actually to me at work this week is my boss asked me to do a time study and to write down everything I'm doing during the day and how long I spent on it. Okay, let's look at the two different thoughts we can have. Thought one, they're going to fire me. They think I don't do enough. So imagine yourself having that thought, right? You got to do a time study. Nobody likes those. And you're thinking they're going to fire me. What's the feeling that you get with that? Just pay attention to it. Now switch it out for thought number two, which is this is an opportunity to show them how much I do. And then notice what the feeling is with that. Hopefully the second one feels a little less stressful. I will tell you from my experience that my colleague had thought number one all week long, and she had anxiety and a pit in her stomach, and she was irritable. I, on the other hand, had thought two, And I was just mildly annoyed at the extra work that I had to do. So one of the things in cognitive behavior therapy that we can do is teach people how to reinterpret some of their misinterpretations. And we ask people to look for some thinking errors. There are many thinking errors. I wanted to highlight the ones that usually drive anxiety today. And then give you an example in that time study thing of what one of those types of thinking errors might look like. Fortune telling is just predicting the future. It's usually in a negative way, and it's usually without sufficient evidence. Mind reading is predicting what somebody else is thinking, usually in a negative way, and usually without sufficient evidence. Catastrophizing, it's a weird word, but that's, if you break it down, it sounds like that. It's usually in conjunction with fortune telling, but it's really focusing exclusively on the worst possible outcome rather than recognizing that there may be less severe outcomes, less bad outcomes. All or nothing thinking kind of is what it sounds like, which is thinking something's all one way or the other. Something's all good or all bad. Perfectionism, if you got the perfectionism, kind of fits in here, thinking either it's all perfect or it's all worthless. All right, this one's a little different. I'm borrowing this from research from the world of sports psychology. Is this a threat or a challenge? So if we look at in sports psychology, if we've got an athlete who's assessing a situation, am I going to be able to beat this other team? All we have to do is ask the question, do I have the sufficient resources to cope with this demand? For athletes, it's, can I run fast enough? Am I strong enough? Can I jump high enough? If the person determines that the answer is, yeah, I got enough resources to be able to pull this off, then that situation is perceived as a challenge. And the way the body responds as far as it releases adrenaline, it has improved blood flow and better cardiac output. And the outcome, the performance is better. If that same person perceives their situation as being beyond their resources, I'm not that fast, I'm not that strong, I can't jump that high, then it's interpreted as a threat and the body responds differently. So depending how you think about something, it changes the way that the body physically responds to stress, and one's healthier than the other one. This underscores the importance of making the correct interpretation. So if everybody's catastrophizing, it's all going to seem like a threat, and we may have more negative physical outcomes because of it. Here's one that maybe you've heard about, but I think is kind of new lately, which is intolerance of uncertainty. Take a look at some of these items. These are pulled from the intolerance of uncertainty scale. The more of these that you say yes to, the more likely you are as somebody who doesn't tolerate uncertainty well. Well, who cares about that? Well, I don't know if you've noticed, but the last few years have been nothing but uncertainty, right? There are so many things we can't know. Am I safe? Is this virus on my groceries? Can I take a vaccine? Can I go on a plane? Are my loved ones safe? Am I going to get sick? Do I get to keep my job? Can I trust my government? Can I trust the police? All sorts of things that we can't know for certain in a given moment. If that uncertainty makes you more anxious, you just kind of doubled your anxiety. And there were a bunch of people who were really uncomfortable with not being able to know stuff, and they still are. If you have a pit in your stomach right now thinking about that, you might have an intolerance of uncertainty. What do we do about that? Well, like any kind of skill, we help patients and clients learn how to tolerate that. And you start with something small, start with some low stakes item. So I'm driving to Evanston Township High School. I'm not sure which door it is. I think it's on Dodge Street. And where's the parking? And I could have spent more time looking it up on the map and doing Google Maps, or I could tolerate the uncertainty that I had the address, I know where this high school is, and I could figure out the parking. So start with something small and try doing it without getting a lot of reassurance from your friends or your family or the internet. And you can feel more comfortable when there's uncertainty. Most people don't like it, but if you can get to come to terms with the fact that it exists and it kind of doesn't feel good and you don't have to fix it, you feel a lot better. Okay, so that was change what you think. Now I'm on change what you do. Deep abdominal breathing. Apparently everybody's got a thing of bubbles. You could start that right now, which I think would be kind of cool. That's up to you. Deep abdominal breathing can be done in a multiple different types of ways and involves relaxing the diaphragm muscle so that you can get a full inhalation of air. It's part of exercises like meditation, yoga, Tai Chi, and Qigong. So it's part of a bunch of different practices. Progressive muscle relaxation. This is a favorite go-to of therapists. We like to teach people how it feels to be relaxed in their body by tensing different muscle groups and then releasing them. Exercise. If you're going to do anything, this seems like the easiest one. Just go for a walk, right? So the effective physical exercise on anxiety, depression, stress, sensitivity to stress, and resilience, your body's physical resilience to stress has been shown in multiple studies. Mindfulness meditation. I talk about a specific kind that's part of a package. It's called mindfulness-based stress reduction. This has been shown to have beneficial effects on stress, anxiety, depression, and improving quality of life. And social support. I think Warson's going to talk about social support. In May, the Surgeon General issued a call to action for us to address social support. But having a social support, and I don't mean 1,000 followers on social media, I mean one person that you can talk to, one person that you feel close to. That social support, again, changes the way that our bodies respond to stress in the good way. And I'm going to leave you with this, right? When most people think about self-care, they think massages and bubble baths. And those things are fantastic, but they're not going to be enough. The self-care that we've talked about today all require time and effort and may not come naturally to you. Relaxation exercises, physical exercise, or meditation is all going to take some time to do. Some of it even takes practice. I don't know if you've done meditation, it might look easy, but sometimes it's a fight. Changing how you think after a bunch of years isn't going to happen in one day. That takes practice too. Turning off the TV, turning down another drink, turning down a request, turning in early will all be things that take effort to do in the beginning. Listening, asking for help, learning how to ask for help, learning that it's okay to do some things imperfectly. Ooh, but that doesn't always feel great, right? Might not feel natural either, but you can learn how to do them so that they do. And finally, I hope that I've been able to convey the message through all these slides that being stressed out is pretty common. You aren't alone. You probably know somebody else who knows what it's like, that it's okay for us to talk about it. And if you need to talk about it, talk to a friend, talk to a family member, talk to one of us nice professionals. And if you know somebody who's feeling the stress, maybe you can share some of the brilliant things that you're going to learn today with that person. So reach out and talk to somebody if you can see the signs of stress on them. And that's it for me. Thank you for your attention.
All right. Greetings, everybody. Just a point of clarification, Dr. Reinecke, I didn't grow up in South Africa and Guyana, but my parents did. So I grew up with immigrant parents from those countries. And obviously that still impacts the experience of how I approach my work and my understanding of human beings. But greetings, Cohen family, distinguished panelists, presenters, friends, colleagues, community members. It's really an honor for me to continue to be a part of this conversation by looking at some of the social, some of the contextual, some of the environmental factors that have continued to impact our lives in this modern world. And it's no surprise that over the last several years, many of us have experienced increasing levels of stress and anxiety, albeit to different degrees and in different ways. And before I dive into some of those particular issues and stressors, I just want to encourage you to prioritize your own mental health as I talk about these very real stressors and traumas in our lives. And I'm pleased to hear that, of course, there's a well-being room that you can use if you need to. At the very end of the segment, I'm also going to offer a collective care activity that taps into this concept of mindfulness, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. I'm a certified practitioner in that model. And I adapted one of the interventions just to kind of help us down-regulate our nervous systems kind of collectively together at the end. You know, as a psychologist, I've been doing therapeutic work for over 2 decades with individuals, with families, communities, and I've come to intimately know that our overall wellness, our overall mental health is impacted by a variety of things, a variety of experiences, of systems. We can experience issues on an individual level or on a household level. For instance, we may grow up in a home where we've been exposed to domestic violence, for instance, or we might be a survivor of sexual abuse or physical abuse. And those sorts of experiences have real impacts on the development of depression, anxiety, and stress of various kinds. But far too often we forget or kind of overlook the contextual factors, the systems level factors that impact our overall wellness and mental health. At the community level, that may look like lack of access to stable housing. It might look like exposure to community violence. It might be our experiences of racism. And in more recent years, we've been talking a lot more about the environmental factors, such as COVID-19, of course, and climate change. And I'm going to be talking about some of the data with respect to some of these topics today. And as I sit across from clients on a day-to-day basis in my work, and as I participate in these sorts of community conversations, what I'm hearing more and more are these real kind of worry-filled, stress-filled narratives and stories. You know, I'm feeling unsafe. We are unsafe. People are unsafe. The world is unsafe. My kids are unsafe, right? And oftentimes these narratives are really tied to increasing levels of stress and anxiety. And so what's really going on here? And as Dr. Reineke, when he opened, you talked about, so there's so many factors, you know, from the genetic to the physiological to these larger contextual and environmental factors. Dr. Stephen Porges' work on polyvagal theory is one that is really helpful to me and has gained more and more attention in the field of mental health in recent years as a way to kind of understand how our nervous systems have evolved over the years to respond to the cues internal to us. So for instance, we may pick up on sensations of pain in our body or our heart rate or our breathing rate. So those are all kind of cues internal to our body that give our nervous system an idea if we're experiencing danger or threat or safety. We also our nervous systems can also pick up on cues in our environment, right? So we may witness a particular threat in the environment. I love the slide, Dr. Young, with the bear there, right? So we can see threats around us in the environment. We can also pull up our smartphones and our social media feeds, and we can see on repeat, you know, the latest news story about climate change, or in real time, we can see a video of an incident of police brutality. So our nervous systems are kind of taking in all of this information in the environment. We also have the ability, our nervous systems have the ability to pick up cues interpersonally that help us assess whether a situation is safe or if it's a threat. So we look at each other's facial expressions, for instance, or body language, or the ways in which we treat each other, right? So those are all sources of information that our nervous systems are using in order to assess whether or not we are safe. As human beings, we have a profound need to connect, right? To connect to ourselves internally, to know kind of how we're feeling, what we're thinking. We also have a profound need to connect to other people and to the world around us, right? And we've evolved in this way to, in this really interconnected web of connections. And these connections help us to feel safe and to also down-regulate and to co-regulate with each other. And the field of mental health has come a long way over the recent decades on documenting how adverse childhood experiences, for instance, impact or disrupt that ability to connect with ourselves, connect with other people, connect with the environment at large. The original ACEs study was conducted by Dr. Vincent Felitti and a group of researchers from the Kaiser Permanente in the late 90s, documenting that the more adverse childhood experiences we encounter in life, the more likely we are to experience chronic health conditions, such as mental health disorders like anxiety or depression, such as asthma, diabetes, and other sorts of chronic health conditions. In more recent years, researchers such as Dr. Roy Wade and colleagues have broadened the list of what's considered to be ACEs by studying more diverse populations. And his group of researchers actually included variables such as discrimination, community violence, exposure to involvement in various systems like the child welfare system and the juvenile justice system. So all of these experiences potentially can have a negative impact on our development of stress and anxiety later in life. And relational connectedness is central to our feeling of belonging, right? And in the research, a sense of belongingness has been really well documented as being a protective factor, meaning that when we experience a feeling of connectedness or belonging in our lives, we are more resilient, right? We're less vulnerable to the impacts of stress, anxiety, and trauma. Yet, as Dr. Young mentioned here, very recently, like last month, this report just came out from Dr. Vivek Murthy, our US Surgeon General, on sort of declaring that Americans are currently experiencing a new public health epidemic of loneliness and isolation. And the report documents that the time that we spend alone has increased significantly over the last 2 decades. And for particular populations like our youth, ages 12 to 24, very, very much impacted. So the report documents that youth have experienced a 70% reduction in the amount of time they spend in person with friends compared to two decades ago. So it's incredibly dramatic. In addition, the report calls out that Americans in general are reporting smaller social networks and smaller numbers of close friends in our lives. And what's concerning is that loneliness and isolation have been shown quite significantly in the research to be predictive of outcomes, negative outcomes such as stress, anxiety, and in more severe situations, may be predictive of suicidal ideation and suicide attempts. So it's very, very concerning data. So what's going on? I mean, certainly we've all lived through the COVID-19 pandemic, and to some degree still living through the COVID-19 pandemic. We certainly can't argue that the pandemic has had some major impacts on our abilities to feel safe, to connect with other people, and just on our overall mental health. But as mentioned, even prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, Americans were experiencing this sense of isolation and loneliness. And so it's only exacerbated those issues. There seems to be two populations in particular that have been negatively impacted by the loneliness and isolation tied to COVID-19 pandemic. And that is, of course, no surprise, young people, but also older adults. So older adults, had a lot of burden in terms of that sense of isolation, mostly in relation to, family members not wanting to expose their elder adults to the COVID-19 virus and the underlying health conditions that many older adults experience. But the anxiety and stress related to isolation and loneliness is not the only impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had. We also experienced reduced access to resources, to goods, to services, to system level supports, right? So, in the field of mental health, we saw as we all went online and telehealth, and not everybody was able to access telehealth services, and many of us have long waiting lists. Many of our community clinics have incredibly long waiting lists during the pandemic. So many people didn't have the access to the services that they needed. Those with underlying health conditions also experienced increasing levels of health anxiety. So the fear of getting sick was a very real and is a very real source of stress and anxiety. Many individuals were impacted by job loss and by financial hardships. And certain groups, such as Black, Indigenous, people of color, and those from lower socioeconomic groups were disproportionately impacted by these sorts of hardships. Those of Asian descent often experienced the stigma around anti-Asian rhetoric, and in some situations, anti-Asian hate crimes. And overall, we've certainly seen the demand increase for mental health services throughout the pandemic. This statistic here from the Centers for Disease Control that I list is one example. And so during that first year of the pandemic, we saw, for instance, ER utilization rates skyrocket for children and adolescents who are in mental health crises. And as if the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic wasn't enough, the world has become increasingly aware and mindful of the historical and ongoing realities of systemic racial oppression, particularly as we watched George Floyd, a 46-year-old Black man, be killed at the hands of a Minneapolis police officer, and also witnessed by other law enforcement personnel. And the list of other people who have lost their lives in similar manners is too long for me to name everybody, but these sorts of traumatic acts are often intimately known by individuals, BIPOC individuals, and community members. However, with the rise in access to social media and our smartphones, many of these incidents are now kind of coming to our global kind of awareness, right? So we can all pull up our smartphones and we can read and we can see these incidents happening in real time. Throughout healthcare the healthcare world and disciplines, we see that there are lots of racial disparities around such. Oh, okay.
Plugged in. So, please stand by.
It's really. Got it? Okay, great. Wait. Sorry about that. So I was saying, throughout our healthcare field, there's lots of documented racial disparities around the prevalence rates for various sorts of conditions, mental health conditions, anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorders, for instance, are often experienced at higher rates in certain populations. Dr. William Smith and colleagues have been calling our attention to the impacts of racial trauma for quite some time, as they've documented the psychological, the behavioral, the physical impacts of racial trauma. They in their research group actually coined the term racial battle fatigue to draw parallels between those who are racialized in this society and who experience racial trauma to those who have been to war, who have been in combat zones. So very, very similar symptom profiles. In addition, there's growing evidence that we are experiencing the psychological distress and anxiety associated with climate change, and mostly in relation to global warming and the impact that's having on a variety of environmental situations, rising sea levels, drought, severe weather-related incidents. Just this past week in our news, we've been hearing about the wildfires in parts of Canada that are impacting obviously those local communities, but also impacting the air quality in various parts of Canada and the United States now. And researchers are documenting that our young people are particularly burdened by this form of anxiety, kind of as they existentially sit with these questions, what does this mean for my future? What does this mean for future generations? In addition to these uncertainties, many of us may actually be sitting with a sense of guilt and shame about our own role in climate change related to the way that we're living our lives, our actions or lack of action. And so it sort of exacerbates the sense of stress and anxiety we feel about what's happening in the environment. Unlike the COVID-19 pandemic, where we can just put on a mask or we can wash our hands or we can socially distance as mitigation strategies, when we approach issues like climate change, we often feel a sense of inadequacy. It's not so, and it's not such a tangible sort of action that we can take to address all of the many environmental variables. International groups such as the International Rescue Committee maintains data on global conflicts and situations of various humanitarian needs that are occurring around the globe. And the IRC has documented record levels of humanitarian need around the globe. Okay. And they maintain a list of regions around the world where there's particularly difficult conflicts. And certainly the war in Ukraine is one that's gotten a lot of attention in recent months and years, but there are a list of other, 10 to 20 other places in the globe where there's significant humanitarian crises occurring in parts of Africa and parts of the Middle East and in some countries like Haiti. The World Health Organization has recently revised the way that they study the prevalence rates for various mental health conditions in these conflict zones. And in recent years, they estimate that about 22%, just over 1 in 5 individuals who are living in these conflict zones will experience some form of mental health disorder like stress, like anxiety or depression or post-traumatic stress. Gun violence is another public health epidemic. In recent years, we've seen the number of both gun-related deaths and mass shootings increase and fairly significantly. For each of the past 3 years, the US has averaged over 600 mass shootings per year. And a mass shooting is defined as a shooting that involves 4 or more victims, not including the shooter. And to highlight some of the recent data from Chicago, researchers Dr. Charles Lanphier and colleagues recently published in JAMA on a 25-year longitudinal study where they tracked Chicagoans over the course of 25 years. And the results were fairly staggering. 56% of Black and Hispanic Chicagoans and 25% of white Chicagoans have witnessed at least one shooting by the time that they turn 40. Male respondents were 5 times as likely as female respondents to be exposed to being shot before the age of 40. And the staggering average age when participants witnessed their first shooting was age 14 for the entire population polled. Gun violence is now the leading cause of death in children in our country. We've also seen increases in the numbers of anti-LGBTQ legislation. For example, in 2023, we've already seen over 400 anti-LGBTQ bills introduced in various state legislatures around this country. We've also experienced a recent mass shooting where patrons of an LGBTQ nightclub were targeted in Colorado. And these acts of discrimination are well-documented sources of stress and anxiety in the LGBTQIA populations, as well as the gender diverse populations. And when we look at the prevalence rates for conditions like anxiety and depression, individuals who identify as LGBTQ or gender diverse experience these conditions at 2.5 times the rates of their cisgender and heterosexual counterparts. And social media has also become a major fixture in our lives. And there's certainly some benefits to social media. So I want to make sure that that gets said as well. But there's some well-documented research that shows that our social media use is actually displacing other really important health promoting activities like in-person social connection, like sleep, like exercise. It is getting in the way of these sorts of really important aspects of our lives. Social media also encourages that social comparison. So how is my life looking in comparison to other people that we're seeing on our social media feeds? There's also this pressure to portray ourselves in our public-facing profiles in certain ways, and it's particularly impactful for young people. And then there's that constant access to all of the things that I just went through, all of those different topics, right? We can just pull up our social media feeds and it's on constant repeat, the stories, the news, the climate change, the police brutality, all of it. And that's creating a heightened sense of this anxiety around our world is unsafe. It can be particularly impactful for those that are from marginalized groups, those that have experienced various sorts of systemic traumas. Cyberbullying is also an important source of stress and anxiety for young people. 23% in this one study of teens have reported being cyberbullied in some way through social media. So I don't know about you, but as I prepared for this talk and reviewed all the research, I started to get very anxious and stressed, right? So it is when we think about it and we look at these issues in very intentional ways, our nervous systems get really activated. So I wanted to make sure that we build in a little bit of down regulation time. And so I do have a recording here that I encourage you all just to participate just for a few minutes. This is taken from an intervention program called mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, and I've adapted it slightly. So just join in or listen. Taking a moment to get into a comfortable posture, one that helps you to feel alert and awake. Closing the eyes if you feel comfortable, and bringing your attention inward. Focus on the body sitting, checking in with and noticing what is present regarding thoughts, emotions, and body sensations. This is an opportunity for you to become aware of what is going on for you in the present moment, in the here and now. And once you are aware of what is going on now in thinking, emotions, and body sensations, gradually shifting your attention to the physical sensations of breathing, using your heart as an anchoring point. You may find it useful to place your hand on your heart while attending to your breath. Notice the expansion of the chest and the abdomen as you inhale, and the deflation as you exhale. Just be with your body breathing for a moment. Finally, shift your attention outward to the entire body, around your breath, to any and all sensations. The temperature of your skin, the feeling of clothing on your body. The best you can, bring a sense of openness and receptive attention to your experience in this moment. Allow your attention to expand further into the room, noticing any sensations, sounds, smells, for example. Continue to allow your attention to expand further outside, to your neighborhood, to your town, region, and country. Allow your attention to reflect upon our global connectedness to one another in this moment. All right, thank you so much for participating in that brief activity. I hope it was just a moment of pause and a chance to just sort of reset your nervous systems. And this final slide, I just want to invite you all to approach your stress and anxiety from almost like a strengths-based, non-pathological perspective, by honoring the wisdom that our bodies are offering us in this moment as it relates to some of the topics that I've gone through today, right? So what is our stress and anxiety calling our attention to? What is that call to action that our stress and anxiety is asking for? What are the changes that we need to achieve here collectively as a group to make this world feel safer for ourselves, for our communities, for our children and future generations to come? So thank you so much. Enjoy the conference.
Hello. During the pandemic, my cousin went through the process. Oh, yes. Sorry. No, you're good. Thank you. Take two. During the pandemic, my cousin went through the process of uploading all of our home videos to the internet, and I was able to watch my entire childhood. And I remember staring at my screen, shocked, because I could see that I moved differently from all the other children. My head was constantly whipping around really quickly, and I was always jerking, my eyes darting. I was an extremely alert, strung out toddler. I remember the first time I ever found words for a physical sensation in my body. I was maybe 4, and I asked my mom to check for ants in my shoes. I was convinced ants were crawling all over my shoes. So she checked, weren't any there. And I asked her, I said, "Why is there sand in my feet? There's sand in my feet, Mommy, why?" And so then she eventually figured out that I was experiencing pins and needles. My feet were probably asleep. Sand in my feet would eventually become sand in my hands, sand in my face. My thighs would frequently feel pins and needles, particularly whenever I was stressed or right before a panic attack. It was usually a sign that my blood was pumping really, really fast. Feeling the sensation is very common. I'm feeling it right now, standing in front of all of you. Headaches, stomach aches, all of these things I experience daily. And when I was younger, I just did not realize that these were symptoms of anxiety. My anxiety made me feel alone, like I was a failure or on the verge of becoming a failure. And then that felt like life or death. If I don't succeed or fix my feelings, I will die. Growing up as a Mexican American, we didn't have a word for anxiety in my family. That wasn't a word that we just threw around often, even though as a unit, I can recognize that we all had anxious tendencies. In my house, we had 8 Chihuahuas, 4 of the canine variety, 4 of the human variety. And as a child, I genuinely felt like I was the only one who was flailing, not having any control over my racing thoughts, especially when it came to panic. So I quickly became known in my family and at school for being a whittle crybaby. I was hyper aware of everything around me at all times, almost like a spidey sense. Like if a teacher was about to get really upset with the entire class, I instinctively would feel that on such a visceral level that it felt like I was constantly vibrating and on the verge of tears. I remember this one time a coach was like admonishing an entire assembly for being too loud, too rowdy. And I was sitting in the back of the auditorium crying because I felt like he was yelling directly at me, or like I was absorbing all of that energy, and it had to go somewhere. And I felt it building and building. And I told myself that if I will myself hard enough, I can just contain it and it can stay inside and I can just focus and I can hide it. But that's not how things work. So very similar to trying to push a ball in a pool underwater, it would just pop right back up, usually 3 times as hard. So this usually looked like explosive crying fits. So explosive that I couldn't communicate through what I was experiencing. You know, I'm talking hiccups and like fighting to breathe. And I remember people waiting, like genuinely looking at me concerned, as if there was something wrong with me, or as if I needed to sit down or go home, which usually made it worse. I didn't like having eyes on me when I couldn't tighten the lid on my emotions. And I would do my best to keep this constant thrumming panic reserved for when I was alone. Easy. But the thing about being a member of a large Mexican-American family is that I was never alone. I spent every weekend at a birthday party, communion, baptism, you name it. There were constant eyes on me. So in the times when it was really bad, as in it was evident that something was happening inside of me and I couldn't hide it, and I felt all those eyes on me, usually what that looked like was my body would just kind of tire itself out. Like I would just have to let things run their course internally until eventually, I'm assuming, it soothed itself, just leaving residual aftershocks kind of pulsing throughout the rest of the day until eventually I would get home and crash. Unfortunately, sleep didn't always come easy for me, not at the times it was supposed to, at least. I was very aware of my immortality at a very young age. I remember being like 4 years old, staying up all night crying because I knew I was going to die someday. And I knew that my mom was going to die someday. And I knew that one day I would have to witness that. Eventually, this escalated into playing movies to go to sleep, because if I was listening to something else that I was already familiar with, then odds are I would bore myself and then I would fall asleep, versus my own thoughts. No, I can think myself awake all night, no problem. I infamously in the 3rd grade at like 3 o'clock in the morning, shot up out of nowhere in bed, like I didn't do my math homework, and I got up and did it. So I was just constantly waiting for some shoe to drop. And in the days where I was praised for making straight A's or for making honor roll, those were great days. But I paid much closer attention to the days where I failed at keeping it all inside. Sobbing in the back seat, telling my sister, stop laughing at me, it's not funny. But it kind of was funny how you would get 2 different reactions. It was either full-blown concern and frustration or amusement. So after a while of being called a drama queen, I decided to put that to use, and I tried theater. And suddenly it was like these giant emotions that I had been containing, they finally had a place where they could air out and they could take up space. Some people think of acting as an extension of lying, but for me, acting was my first opportunity to be really honest. Theater was the one place where imagining the unimaginable and letting that live in my body was applaudable. And I reframed my perception of my vulnerability from a flaw to a tool that could be used to bring people together and to give crowds of people the same opportunity that I had, which was to feel things safely. And what was wild was I always believed myself to be like this walking, talking sob story, but just like my sister, my tears were usually what people laughed at the most. I took a clown class in college, and my teacher gave us a basketball, and he told us to pretend that this basketball was our own definition of the sublime. You know, endow the basketball with the sublime, react to it as the sublime. And I stood in a room full of clowns holding this basketball, and I wept. There were sounds coming out of my body that I had never heard before. And my teacher says, step away from the crying clown. And he sends everybody else to sit down. And I'm standing up there alone with the basketball for God knows how long, until eventually I look at him and I go, why? And he looks me dead in my eyes and he says, because it's funny when you hold it. Acting gave me confidence to actually look at my own behaviors with curiosity instead of judgment, and to find language that was different from the very stigmatic words that I did grow up with. So took to Google and I looked up anxiety. I said, yep, that's it. That's exactly what I'm experiencing. But I didn't know for sure until I tried therapy when I was 26. I originally just wanted a space strictly for me to process my thoughts. But after a few months, I worked up the courage to ask, so do I have a diagnosis of anything? Is that something you can tell me? Is that something you're allowed to tell me? And she was like, yeah, I would say that you have generalized anxiety disorder. So I felt seen and accomplished. I had finally earned my badge of anxiety. And it has been exciting to give my parents new language for their own experiences, because it's been a common thread throughout my entire life with my family to see these scary behaviors that I couldn't make sense of. Before every party, family event, my parents would scream, yelling back and forth from the moment that we were getting dressed to go out, to walking the dogs before we left, to the entire drive on the way. And I perceived this to be fury or hatred, especially from my dad. And when I was smaller, this was scary. And it felt like a choice. It felt like my parents fighting was a risk, that I was going to lose everything. Now I'm able to see those moments as experiences of collective social anxiety. We were all nervous about being seen or being judged. And what I thought was rage from my father was really his own blood pumping at this accelerated rate. And he's not twitching his hands because he's looking to, deck somebody. He's twitching his hands because his hands are just as numb as mine. And now I have the ability to assure him gently in these moments that he doesn't have anything to worry about. And that being able to just give him that reassurance has been revolutionary, because my dad, my mom, nobody had this language growing up. And it can be a little bit of a double-edged sword, because while I'm excited about the growth in my family, I do frequently get phone calls from mom. You need to talk to your father. It's different when you do it. It's not the same when I do it. You do it better. And my mom has also started looking at her own behaviors and habits. And she's curious about getting therapy, which is really exciting, because her version of anxious behavior was very strict survival mode. I have memories of my mom dragging her finger along glasses at every restaurant, concerned that glass had chipped and we were going to drink it. I wasn't allowed to sleep over at friends' houses. I would always get picked up at 9:30 p.m. on the dot for friends' parties. I wasn't allowed to ride in other people's cars, because if anybody was going to get in a wreck with her baby, it was going to be her. All these things that I think, as a small person learning about the world, added to my own natural fears, I'm able to look at now through the lens of, you just wanted to keep us alive and healthy the best way you knew how, based on the trauma you had experienced and the lessons that life taught you. And so that's been really cool to admire the attention to detail and to be empowered by it. A year ago, I was walking home late at night. My entire body lit up, pins and needles. My body was able to figure out before I did that a car had been following me, and I had just enough time to run into a nearby neighborhood, call a lift, and get home safely. So those spidey senses saved my life that night. I know that. And yet, my own relationship to my anxiety goes through these ebbs and flows. I'm still hiding my little worries like acorns in a tree. Like, no, they're in there. They're safe for the winter. Nobody gets to see where they are. And I struggle with this feeling of needing to hide them, because I do sometimes feel like other people see my emotions as weakness even with this widened understanding, you know, I'm supposed to be showing confidence. Confidence is sexy, and I should be able to conduct myself in a professional manner. Anxiety plays an essential role in my acting career. It makes sure I show up early to auditions. My material is prepped. At the same time, it can be frustrating to watch my unread emails climb higher than my paycheck. So my goal is always to navigate my own anxiety by trying to have more days where I integrate it into my life versus the days where it's a wall that I build to keep other people out. My dad did give me this very sweet quote. He called me one time, funnily enough, while I was having a panic attack. And he said something I never thought I would hear him say. He said, you know, Gabby, your emotion is your greatest superpower. It's your fuel. He was like, emotion is just, it's just energy. And if you have a lot of it, baby, you should use it because it's going to keep you going. So I try to remind myself to think of my emotions as something that can flow through me and remind myself that my anxiety is a beautiful part of me that I can wield as a tool for survival, for success, and for connection. Thank you.
Hey, we got started a little bit late, so we're not really going to have time for the Q&A because we want to keep on schedule for the rest of the day. We want to thank, obviously, our panelists and Dr. Reineke for being with us today and for sharing their expertise. All three of you are experts in what you've presented. So skipping on a few notes, we're going to need to shorten our break. Certainly use the restroom, do what you need to do. If you need to get a beverage, another bottle of water, you can do that. We're going to proceed from here to the first round of breakout sessions. Volunteers and conference staff will direct you to the classrooms. If you need a reminder, your selected session should be on the back of your name tag, and their locations are listed on the yellow paper in your folder, and there are posters also around with those room locations. After our morning breakout session is over, you'll come back to the cafeteria where we had our breakfast for lunch. And while it may not apply to today's event, when I'm conducting full day trainings, we break for lunch. I challenge participants to give themselves just 5 minutes to check emails and voicemails and to spend the rest of their time screen-free, off their devices, eating their lunch, resting and nourishing without talking about anything related to work. You should see the panic that I get in response to that. But think about that as you go back to work or school or whatever your activities are this week. Do you take a lunch? I invite you to challenge yourself to take at least a 30-minute break away from your computer and all other devices. Take alone time or recharge by eating with someone else. Make it a rule not to talk about work. Research shows that your stress level will decrease and that you'll be more focused and creative and ready to engage. It's ready to be done. I'd like to thank the Cohen family, the conference committee, all of our panelists, presenters, and sponsors, ETHS, and of course, the amazing NRCI team and volunteers assisting us today. I thank you all again for taking the time to be with us today, whether in person or online. Before exiting, this is where I remind you again, please take a minute to sign out of the panel and complete the presentation evaluation using the QR code either on your orange paper, or our volunteers again are available with that sign out code. A reminder that if you are seeking CEUs, you must complete that electronic sign out process or they will not issue them. And we'll repeat that process again throughout the day. So we've got 5 minutes Before we start those morning breakout sessions, presenters, I do want to make sure that those breakout sessions last a full 60 minutes for those seeking the CEUs. So again, please complete the sign out and the evaluation for the panel, and then go ahead and proceed to your classroom breakout session if you're staying for breakouts. Again, thank you for our presenters, our panel, everyone. It is. I also forgot, they're going to kill me. We have note cards available for a $20 suggested donation. So at the registration table, if you're interested in some NRCI note cards to send thoughts to friends. But yes, that's a wrap. Thank you.